When a prejudiced family is saved from a perilous situation by a stranger they barely know, they're forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about their own beliefs. As hidden identities are revealed and prejudices unravel, George Henderson's life takes an unexpected turn, one that will challenge everything he thought he knew about people and himself. But can he change before it's too late? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The Henderson family's Saturday afternoon began like any other, a routine chore driving them to the supermarket. George Henderson sat behind the wheel, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel impatiently as he waited for a break in traffic. His gray hair glistened under the sunlight, and his face, often set in a look of mild disapproval, mirrored his inner thoughts. He was a man of strict principles, or at least he thought so, and his views on the world were often as rigid as his demeanor. "Could have done this earlier," George grumbled to his wife, Linda, as they pulled into the parking lot. "But no, we have to wait until everyone in the city decides to shop at the same time." Linda offered him a mild smile, her eyes tired. She was used to his complaints by now, having been married to him for over 2 decades. She tucked a strand of her long blonde hair behind her ear and turned to their daughter Emily, sitting in the back seat. Emily, 17, had her headphones in, tapping away on her phone, utterly detached from the world around her. "Emily," Linda called softly, "we're here. Put that phone away and help with the shopping." Emily didn't hear her, too lost in the music and the scrolling on her screen. George, noticing his daughter's aloofness, sighed in frustration. He hated how disconnected teenagers were these days, always glued to their devices, never fully present. Emily was no exception. The family stepped out of the car and made their way toward the store's entrance. The parking lot was bustling with activity, families loading groceries, children running alongside carts, and shoppers moving in and out in a steady flow. George held the door for his wife and daughter, watching them enter before stepping in himself. His eyes quickly scanned the aisles, taking in the busy scene. As they moved toward the produce section, George's attention was drawn to a tall man on the other side of the aisle. The man, probably in his late 30s, had dark skin, close-cropped hair, and an air of quiet confidence about him. He was dressed casually, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a pair of sneakers. But something about him caught George's eye. He couldn't say exactly why, but the man didn't seem like he belonged here, in this store, in this part of town. "Look at that guy," George muttered to Linda as they walked past the shelves of apples and oranges. "What do you think? Probably doesn't even live around here." Linda shot him a look, her lips tightening into a thin line. She knew where this was going. George had a habit of making snap judgments about people, especially those who didn't look like him. It wasn't overt racism, at least not in his eyes, but it was a persistent prejudice that showed up in small, uncomfortable ways. "George, don't," Linda whispered, glancing around nervously to see if anyone could overhear. She didn't want to cause a scene, especially not in a public place. "I'm just saying," George continued, lowering his voice but keeping the edge in his tone. "What's someone like him doing in this neighborhood? Probably some kind of troublemaker." Linda shook her head, choosing not to engage further. It was easier that way. She had learned over the years that arguing with George about these things only led to more frustration. Instead, she focused on picking out the freshest apples, ignoring the way her husband's gaze kept drifting toward the man on the other side of the aisle. As they moved through the store, George couldn't help but notice the man again and again. He saw him helping an elderly woman reach a box of cereal from a high shelf in the breakfast aisle. Then later, he caught a glimpse of him in the dairy section, calmly inspecting the expiration dates on a carton of milk. Each time, George's irritation grew, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Always trying to play the hero, aren't they?" George muttered under his breath, loud enough for Linda to hear, but quiet enough to avoid drawing attention. Linda didn't respond this time. Instead, she glanced at Emily, who was still mostly oblivious to the world around her, scrolling through her phone with a distracted look on her face. Linda sighed inwardly, feeling a pang of guilt that her daughter was growing up in an environment where such casual prejudice was a part of their daily lives. She wondered how much Emily had absorbed over the years, even if she never said anything. By the time they reached the checkout line, George was still simmering with quiet annoyance. As they waited behind an elderly couple who were taking their time unloading their cart, George's gaze landed on the man once more. He was at the next register, paying for his items with an air of calm and efficiency. Something about the man's composure only made George angrier. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this man, with his easy confidence and quiet demeanor, was somehow out of place. George had always prided himself on being a good judge of character, and something about this stranger just didn't sit right with him. "People like him," George muttered, barely audible to Linda. "They always act like they're better than everyone else, but we know the truth, don't we?" Linda shot him a sharp look, but before she could respond, a sudden commotion erupted near the store's entrance. The sharp sound of something crashing to the floor echoed through the store, followed by a string of panicked shouts. George's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the source of the noise. His irritation quickly turned to fear as he realized that the peaceful afternoon grocery run was about to take a dangerous turn. In a split second, the Hendersons' routine day had been upended, and they were about to face a situation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the world and about themselves. The commotion at the front of the store quickly escalated. At first, it was just a loud crash. A display of canned goods knocked to the floor, rolling across the shiny supermarket tiles. But within moments, it became clear that this was not an ordinary mishap. George, Linda, and Emily stood frozen in place as the chaotic scene unfolded before them. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very fabric of the room had been pulled taut, waiting to snap. A man, disheveled, with wild eyes and erratic movements, was standing near the entrance. He had overturned the display and now held a shopping bag, but it wasn't filled with groceries. His frantic, jerky movements and the way he glanced around told everyone that something was terribly wrong. The store's security guard, a young, undertrained man, looked uncertain of what to do, his hand resting nervously on his radio. The atmosphere thickened with fear as the man took a few steps toward the checkout counters. Shoppers were backing away, unsure of how to react. There were whispers, quick exchanges of nervous glances, and mothers pulling their children closer. "What is he doing?" Linda whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands instinctively reached for Emily, pulling her close, even as Emily stood still, her eyes wide and fixed on the scene. George, however, stood rigid. His face had drained of color, but his jaw was set, trying to assess the situation. He'd never dealt with anything like this before. The comfortable bubble of their suburban life had shielded them from most of the world's more unpleasant realities. Without warning, the man lunged toward the nearest checkout counter, knocking over a display of gum and magazines. He grabbed a few random items, shoving them into his bag. A cashier, startled, let out a small scream before backing away, her hands raised. "Stay behind me," George ordered, his voice low but firm, as he moved to shield Linda and Emily with his body. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. The exit was blocked, and there were too many people in the way. The situation was spiraling out of control. A few brave shoppers had tried to reason with the man, but he wasn't listening. His wild, desperate eyes betrayed a mind clouded with panic, or perhaps something worse. There was no telling what he would do next, and the fear in the room was becoming infectious. People were edging toward the back of the store, trying to distance themselves from the danger. Suddenly, George's worst fear came true. The man's frantic gaze locked onto them. George could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the man started to move in their direction, eyes narrowing as if he were assessing them. "Oh my God," Linda whispered, clutching Emily tightly. George's mind raced. His body felt frozen, stuck in place as he faced the approaching threat. He had no idea what to do. Every logical thought in his mind was drowned out by the blaring siren of fear. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to think of something, anything, to protect his family. But before George could even take a step, something unexpected happened. Marcus, the man George had been watching with suspicion earlier, stepped forward, moving calmly but deliberately toward the unfolding chaos. He hadn't been far from the Hendersons, and now he was walking with purpose, his movements steady and unhurried, despite the panic around him. George watched in disbelief as Marcus positioned himself between the threatening man and the Henderson family. There was no hesitation, no sign of fear. It was as if Marcus had calculated everything in a split second and decided he needed to act. "What is he doing?" George muttered, his voice filled with equal parts confusion and disbelief. Linda clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "He's going to get hurt," she whispered urgently. "George, he's going to—" But Marcus didn't appear concerned with his own safety. He raised his hands slightly, palms facing outward in a gesture of calm. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, almost soothing. "Hey," Marcus said, addressing the frantic man. "Let's take it easy, all right? Nobody here wants any trouble." The man blinked, momentarily thrown off by the calmness in Marcus's voice. He hesitated, his movements becoming less jerky, less aggressive. "I don't want any trouble either," the man shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I just need—" "I get it," Marcus interrupted softly, keeping his voice steady, "but this isn't going to help you, all right? Look, you're scaring people, and you don't want that. Just take a breath." The store was silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Shoppers and employees alike seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The man's eyes darted around, as if he were looking for a way out. His grip on the bag loosened slightly. Marcus, seeing the opportunity, took a step closer, slow, deliberate, non-threatening. "You don't want this," Marcus said, his voice still calm, still steady. "I know you don't. Just put the stuff down, all right? Let's talk about this." The man hesitated for a long moment, his eyes shifting between Marcus and the other shoppers. His breathing was still heavy, his body tense, but something in Marcus's demeanor seemed to reach him. Slowly, he dropped the bag to the floor, his shoulders sagging, as if the weight of his panic had suddenly become too much to bear. The tension in the air began to ease, though no one dared move just yet. Marcus didn't take his eyes off the man, continuing to speak in that same calm, even tone. "It's okay," Marcus said. "Just take it easy. Nobody's hurt. We can figure this out." The man stood there, breathing heavily, but the aggression in his posture had faded. Marcus kept his distance, giving him space, but not letting his guard down. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience and composure. Behind them, George, Linda, and Emily were still frozen in place, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. George couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man he had so easily dismissed, the man he had insulted under his breath, had just stepped in and diffused a situation that could have gone horribly wrong. Finally, the store's security guard, emboldened by Marcus's actions, approached the man cautiously, hand resting on his radio. "Sir," the guard said quietly, "we need you to come with me." The man, now drained of energy and fight, nodded weakly and allowed the guard to escort him away. The tension in the store finally broke, and a collective sigh of relief washed over the crowd. People began moving again, murmuring in disbelief about what had just happened. Marcus, without seeking any recognition, quietly turned and walked away, leaving the scene as calmly as he had entered it. He glanced back briefly at George, Linda, and Emily, offering them a small nod before disappearing into the aisles. George, still processing everything, stood speechless. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite place. He had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that shook the foundations of his ingrained beliefs. But instead of gratitude or acknowledgement, George's first reaction was confusion, followed by something uglier, resentment. How had this stranger, someone he had judged so harshly, stepped in where George had failed? How had he remained so calm in the face of danger while George had been paralyzed by fear? As the Henderson family left the store, still shaken by the events, George's mind was spinning. He had no idea that this encounter would lead him down a path of self-reflection that he had never anticipated. He wasn't ready to face the truth just yet. But karma, as it always does, had a way of making itself known. The ride home from the supermarket was eerily quiet. George gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he replayed the events over and over in his mind. Linda sat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, still shaken from the ordeal. Emily, seated in the back, finally, without her headphones, looked out the window in silence. The weight of the day hung heavy in the air, thick with unresolved tension and unspoken thoughts. George couldn't shake the image of Marcus stepping in during the chaos. He felt a strange combination of embarrassment and anger. In that moment, George had been powerless, frozen in fear, while Marcus, the man he had silently belittled, had taken control of the situation. Worse yet, Marcus had done so with a calm that George couldn't comprehend. George hated how small it made him feel. They arrived home, and as soon as George parked the car, Emily bolted out and headed inside, her mind whirling with a mix of emotions. Linda followed slowly behind, glancing at George before closing the front door behind her. She knew he was upset, but she also knew better than to confront him when he was like this. He needed time to process, or at least that's what she told herself. Inside, Emily retreated to her room, shutting the door softly behind her. She leaned against it, her heart racing. The scene at the store kept replaying in her mind, Marcus stepping in front of them, saving them. And then, the words her father had whispered before that, the offhand comments, the judgment. Her parents had always held certain views Emily had grown up hearing but never really questioned. They had always been framed as the way things are or just how the world works. But now, after witnessing Marcus's bravery, those words didn't sit right with her. They never had, but today had made her realize just how deeply wrong they felt. As she lay on her bed, Emily scrolled through her phone, trying to distract herself. But no matter how many posts she skimmed or how many texts from her friends she ignored, she couldn't shake the feeling of confusion gnawing at her. How could her father, the man she looked up to, the man who always taught her to stand up for herself, be so blind? Downstairs, George paced the living room, his mind still buzzing. He wanted to say something, to unload the tangled thoughts swirling in his head, but he didn't know how. Linda, sensing his frustration, quietly made them both cups of tea and sat down on the couch, waiting for him to speak. It was a ritual they had fallen into over the years, her waiting patiently while he fumed, until eventually he would say something to break the silence. "What was that man's deal?" George finally muttered, sinking into his armchair across from her. His eyes were dark with lingering resentment. Why would someone like him step in like that? What was he trying to prove? Linda sipped her tea slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think he was trying to prove anything, George. He just helped. Someone had to do something." George's brow furrowed. "Yeah, but what gives him the right to be the hero? Just because he looks calm doesn't mean he's trustworthy." Linda set her cup down gently, folding her hands in her lap. Maybe it wasn't about trust. Maybe it was just about doing the right thing. George huffed, leaning back in his chair. He couldn't understand it. He didn't want to understand it. To him, the world was divided into people who could be trusted and those who couldn't. People like Marcus, people who didn't belong in their neighborhood or fit his narrow idea of who was good, were automatically suspect. But today had shaken that certainty. As George stewed in his thoughts, Emily came downstairs, her face pale but determined. She stood in the doorway of the living room, watching her parents quietly before speaking. "Dad," Emily began, her voice uncharacteristically steady, "why did you say those things about him?" George blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "What things?" "You know what I mean," Emily pressed, her eyes narrowing. "You said things about him before. You didn't even know him, but you assumed he was." She paused, the words hanging uncomfortably in the air. "You assumed things about him just because of how he looks." George shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the sudden confrontation. He wasn't used to his daughter challenging him like this. "Emily, it's not that simple. You don't understand how the world works." "But why?" Emily interrupted, her voice trembling now. "Why does it matter what he looks like? He saved us, Dad. He didn't have to, but he did. And you just—" "Enough, Emily," George snapped, standing up abruptly. "You're too young to understand. There are things in this world you don't see yet. People like him, they're not always what they seem." "But what does that even mean?" Emily shouted, her frustration bubbling over. "He's a person, Dad. He's a person, just like us. And you judged him for no reason. He could have gotten hurt helping us, and you still don't care." Linda watched the exchange silently, her eyes filled with concern. She had never seen Emily this worked up before, and it worried her. But she also knew that this conversation had been a long time coming. Emily had always been more open-minded than her father, more empathetic, and today had clearly pushed her to a breaking point. George stood there, staring at his daughter, his mind reeling. He didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know how to explain his feelings because deep down, he wasn't sure he could justify them anymore. The truth was, Marcus's actions had shattered the assumptions George had clung to for so long, and now he was left feeling lost, unsure of how to reconcile his beliefs with the reality he had witnessed. Emily, seeing that her father had no real response, shook her head in disappointment. "You're wrong, Dad," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "You're wrong about him." With that, she turned and walked back upstairs, leaving George standing there in stunned silence. He sat back down slowly, his thoughts swirling. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. Doubt in his own beliefs, doubt in the way he saw the world. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the silence was thick and heavy. No one spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts. George kept glancing at Emily, who avoided his gaze, her mind still racing from their earlier argument. It wasn't until the next morning that George's world was shaken even further. They were sitting at the breakfast table when Linda's phone buzzed with a message. She opened it, her eyes widening as she read. "George," she said slowly, her voice filled with surprise, "you'll never believe this." "What?" George asked, not particularly interested. "Remember that man from the store, the one who helped us?" Linda continued, her eyes still fixed on her phone. "His name is Marcus Evans. He's a millionaire. He runs one of the biggest tech companies in the state." George blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "What?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "He's a self-made businessman," Linda said, handing George her phone to show him the article. "And he's done a lot of charity work, too. He's well known." George stared at the screen, his heart sinking as he read. All this time, he had assumed that Marcus was some ordinary person who didn't belong in their neighborhood. He had judged him based on nothing but his appearance. And now, here he was, finding out that Marcus was not only a hero, but a man of incredible success and generosity. Emily, who had been quietly listening from her spot at the table, glanced at her father. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She didn't need to say, "I told you so." The truth was plain to see. George put down the phone, his face pale. For the first time in a long time, he was forced to confront the bitter truth. His prejudices, his assumptions, and his misplaced anger had blinded him to the reality of the world. And now he was left wondering how he could ever make it right. The morning after Linda's revelation left George reeling. He couldn't shake the gnawing discomfort that had settled deep in his gut. He had always prided himself on being a man who saw things clearly, who knew how the world worked. But now, with the truth about Marcus staring him in the face, George found himself grappling with a reality he had never expected to confront. As he sat at the kitchen table, nursing his coffee, George's mind churned. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind? He had spent the entire day at the supermarket judging Marcus, convinced that he was some random nobody who didn't belong in their part of town. And yet it turned out that Marcus was not only successful, but also highly respected. Linda moved quietly around the kitchen, sensing her husband's internal struggle, but knowing better than to press him. She had always understood that George's worldview was rigid, shaped by years of narrow experiences and limited exposure to diversity. But even she had been surprised to learn just how wrong he had been about Marcus. The news had caught her off guard too, but in a different way. She had never shared George's prejudices to the same degree, though she had often chosen to remain silent rather than challenge him outright. But this felt like a wake-up call she couldn't ignore. Emily was upstairs, still avoiding any unnecessary interaction with her parents since the heated argument the previous night. She was trying to make sense of her own thoughts, too. It was clear that her father's worldview was crumbling, but Emily wasn't sure how to approach him anymore. A part of her still felt angry, disappointed that her father had held on to such small-minded beliefs for so long. But another part of her, the softer part, felt sorry for him, because for the first time in her life, She could see that George was genuinely lost. By mid-morning, the atmosphere in the house was still thick with unspoken tension. George sat on the couch, flipping mindlessly through TV channels, his thoughts far from the screen in front of him. Linda, having grown tired of the heavy silence, finally spoke up. "George," she began, keeping her tone light but direct, "maybe this is a good thing. Maybe this is a chance to rethink things, about people." George's eyes flicked toward her, narrowing slightly. "What are you talking about?" Linda sat down across from him, choosing her words carefully. Marcus. He wasn't what you thought he was, George. You judged him. But look at the facts. He's done so much for the community. You were wrong about him." George bristled. "So now you're saying I'm just some ignorant fool, is that it?" His voice carried an edge of defensiveness. Linda held up her hands, trying to diffuse his rising temper. "That's not what I'm saying. I just think maybe you should consider that the way you see people isn't always right. People are more than what you think, George." George let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his graying hair. He knew she was right, but admitting that felt like an enormous blow to his pride. He had always seen himself as a man of sound judgment, someone who could read people well. Yet here he was, facing the undeniable truth that he had been wrong, deeply wrong. Before he could respond, the doorbell rang, breaking the tension in the room. Linda stood, grateful for the distraction, and went to answer it. George listened as she exchanged a few words with whoever was at the door, her tone one of surprise. When she returned, she was holding an envelope. "This was just delivered," she said, handing it to George. George frowned, taking the envelope from her. There was no return address, but it was addressed to him. He tore it open, revealing a neatly folded letter inside. As he unfolded it, his heart skipped a beat when he saw the name at the bottom of the page. Marcus Evans. For a moment, George just stared at the letter, unsure if he should even read it. He felt a mix of emotions, shame, curiosity, and an odd sense of anticipation. Finally, he cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice low. "Dear George Henderson, I hope this letter finds you well. I want to start by saying that I hold no ill feelings toward you or your family for what happened at the supermarket. I've been in enough situations to understand that sometimes fear and stress can bring out parts of us that we may not be proud of. I'm writing not for an apology, but in the hope that this experience has given you something to reflect on. We live in a world where assumptions are often made based on appearances, where judgments come too easily and understanding comes too slowly. I've seen it happen to me countless times, and I know it's not always personal. But I also know that these assumptions can cause harm, not just to those they're directed at, but to those who hold them. I've been fortunate in my life. I've had opportunities and successes that many people would never expect when they look at me. But those successes don't define who I am. What defines me, and what defines all of us, is how we treat others. In that moment at the store, I didn't step in because I wanted recognition or because I thought I had something to prove. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I believe in helping others when I can, regardless of who they are or what they look like. I'm not writing to preach or to lecture. I'm writing because I hope that this experience has shown you that there's more to people than meets the eye. We all carry stories, histories, and experiences that aren't visible on the surface. My hope is that the next time you meet someone new, you'll take a moment to consider that there's always more to them than what you see at first glance. Take care, and I wish you and your family well. Sincerely, Marcus Evans. As George finished reading, the room fell into a heavy silence. He sat there, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He felt raw, exposed, as if the letter had peeled back layers of his carefully constructed identity and left him vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long time, George was speechless. Linda watched him closely, her heart aching for him, but also for Marcus and for the countless others like him who had been subjected to unfair judgment. She had never seen George this shaken before, and she knew that this letter had struck a deep chord. Emily, who had been listening from the stairs, slowly descended and stood in the doorway, her face soft with compassion. "Dad," she said quietly, "he's right. You've always told me to be strong, to be fair, and to do the right thing. But maybe it's time you do the same. George looked up at his daughter, her words sinking in. He couldn't find it in himself to argue anymore. For the first time in his life, he realized that his views, the ones he had clung to so tightly, had been wrong. And it was Marcus, the very man he had judged so harshly, who had opened his eyes. The shame was almost unbearable, but beneath it, George felt something new. A glimmer of hope, a chance for change. The days that followed Marcus's letter were marked by an uncomfortable silence in the Henderson household. George, once a man so sure of himself and his worldview, had become unusually quiet. He spent his evenings sitting on the porch, staring out into the distance, his mind churning with thoughts he'd never had to confront before. Linda watched him from inside, sensing the weight of his internal struggle. She had never seen him like this, so subdued, so reflective. She wasn't sure if it was the letter, the incident at the supermarket, or the realization of how wrong he had been. But whatever it was, it had changed something fundamental in George. He was no longer the man who scoffed at the world's complexities with casual prejudice. Instead, he seemed to be grappling with the idea that he had been living in a self-imposed bubble, insulated from the truth about people and their experiences. Emily, on the other hand, felt a sense of relief. She had grown up under the weight of her father's rigid views, and though she had never shared them, she had also never openly challenged him until now. It felt like a turning point for her, a chance to forge a new understanding between them, one based on empathy and respect, rather than fear and judgment. One evening, after several days of quiet reflection, George finally spoke. He had gathered his family in the living room, his face pale but determined. The soft hum of the evening crickets filtered in through the open window as he sat across from Linda and Emily, looking more vulnerable than they had ever seen him. "I need to say something," George began, his voice low and measured. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about Marcus, about the way I've been thinking, and about the way I've acted." Linda and Emily exchanged a glance but said nothing, giving him the space to speak. "I was wrong," George said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been wrong for a long time. I judged him without knowing him, without knowing anything about him. I made assumptions, and they were based on nothing but my own ignorance." The admission hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of ingrained prejudice. George swallowed hard, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "I always thought I understood people," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I thought I knew who to trust, who to avoid, but what I've realized is, I've been blind. Blind to my own biases, blind to the fact that people are more than what they seem. I don't know how to fix that, but I want to try." Linda's heart ached as she listened to her husband. She could see how much this admission was costing him, how deeply it wounded his pride to admit that he had been wrong. But at the same time, she felt a sense of hope, a flicker of something better on the horizon. This was the man she had always believed George could be, the man she had hoped their daughter would look up to. Emily, who had been sitting quietly beside her mother, finally spoke. "Dad," she said softly, "it's okay to change. It's okay to grow. You always told me that we should learn from our mistakes, right? Well, this is one of those times." George looked at his daughter, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. He had always been proud of Emily, but now, more than ever, he realized how much he had underestimated her capacity for understanding. She wasn't just a child following in his footsteps, she was her own person, capable of seeing the world with more clarity than he had ever given her credit for. "I'm sorry, Emily," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for the way I've been. I didn't realize how much I was passing on to you, how much of my own baggage I was making you carry." Emily shook her head gently. "It's not too late, Dad. We can all change. You taught me to be strong, but now it's my turn to teach you that strength comes from admitting when we're wrong." George's chest tightened at his daughter's words. He had spent so many years trying to be the authority, the one who had all the answers. But now, sitting in front of his family, he realized that true wisdom wasn't about always being right. It was about learning, growing, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to admit when you were wrong. The following week, George decided to take a step he never would have imagined himself taking before. He wanted to thank Marcus in person. It wasn't just about the supermarket incident anymore. It was about everything. The letter, the truth that Marcus had opened his eyes to, and the grace with which he had handled a situation that could have easily escalated into something much worse. He found Marcus's office address through a local directory, and with some nervousness, he made the trip downtown. It was a sleek, modern building, exactly the kind of place George had always felt uncomfortable entering. But today, he forced himself to push through his discomfort. This wasn't about his pride anymore. As he stepped inside the building, he was greeted by a friendly receptionist who directed him to Marcus's office. The walk down the hallway felt long, each step echoing in George's mind like a reminder of how far he had come. Not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. When he finally reached the door, he took a deep breath and knocked. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood Marcus. He was dressed in a crisp, tailored suit this time, his demeanor as calm and composed as ever. But when he saw George standing there, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Mr. Henderson," Marcus said, his tone neutral but polite, "I wasn't expecting you." George cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice slightly shaky. "Not just for what you did at the supermarket, but for everything. The letter, the lesson. I've been wrong about a lot of things." Marcus didn't respond right away. He studied George for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then he nodded slowly and stepped aside, gesturing for George to come in. "I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson," Marcus said as George entered the office. "It takes a lot to admit when we've been wrong." George nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. I wanted you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what you said in your letter, and I know I have a long way to go, but I want to change. I don't want to be the man I was." Marcus smiled, a small but genuine expression. "That's a good start, George. We all have room to grow, and the fact that you're willing to take that step, it says a lot." For the first time in what felt like years, George felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having all the answers, but the kind that came from accepting that he didn't, and that it was okay to keep learning. As George left Marcus's office that day, he felt lighter, as if the weight of years of resentment and prejudice had begun to lift. He still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he was willing to walk it with an open mind. When he returned home that evening, Emily was waiting for him in the kitchen. She looked at him with a curious smile. "How did it go?" she asked, already sensing that something had changed. George smiled back at her, his heart swelling with pride, not for himself, but for his daughter, who had shown him a new way to see the world. "It went well," he said. I think it's the start of something better." Emily nodded, her smile widening. "I'm proud of you, Dad." George, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time, pulled his daughter into a hug. "I'm proud of you too, kid. More than you know." And for the first time in years, George Henderson knew he was on the right path. Not because it was the easy one, but because it was the one that would finally make him a better man. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.